The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, a frequency that hadn't changed in 16 years, which Margaret Walsh knew because she counted them on her worst nights. 3 months into night shifts at Mercy General in Norfolk, and she had learned to move through the hospital corridors like water finding its path downhill, present but unremarkable, competent but invisible, exactly as she had planned. The rubber soles of her shoes made no sound on the polished tile. The badge clipped to her scrubs bore only her last name and the word RN, nothing more, nothing less. Under the harsh white glow above Trauma Bay 3, Margaret prepared and four-line for an incoming patient from the psychiatric ward, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory led upon muscle memory. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Her scarred knuckles didn't tremble. They never did. A young resident named Chen watched from the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes tracking her movements with the particular intensity of someone trying to understand how she made it look so easy. The needle went in on the first attempt. The tourniquet came off. Blood backed up into the chamber, proof of placement, and Margaret taped it down with movements so economical they looked choreographed. Chen stepped closer. He smelled like burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion that came from a 72-hour rotation. "How long have you been nursing?" he asked. Margaret didn't look up from flushing the line. 23 years and some months, she said, her voice carrying the flatness of someone stating a fact rather than offering conversation. Chen's eyebrows lifted slightly. She looked 50, maybe less. The math didn't work unless she'd started as a teenager. Margaret had learned to let people do that math and arrive at their own wrong conclusions. The real answer lived in a locked box in her apartment, along with a blue-face Submariner watch she no longer wore, 3 folded letters she hadn't opened, and a photograph of herself in dress white standing beside a woman who no longer spoke to her. But that Margaret, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, call sign Reaper, 3 silver stars, 2 bronze stars, the only field medic to pull 3 extraction teams out of a burning surgical tent in Baghdad while keeping every single one of them alive, that Margaret had ceased to exist on the day she signed the medical discharge papers and disappeared into the civilian healthcare system like a ghost sinking into fog. Norfolk had been chosen specifically because no one here knew her family, had never heard the stories, would never connect the quiet night nurse with the decorated combat veteran. She had wanted to fade. She had succeeded. The combat boots sat at the bottom of her locker, laces still knotted from the day she'd removed them in a triage tent outside Kandahar province. The leather had cracked in 12 places. The right sole had come partially detached from the upper in a way that made them unwearable by any practical standard. She kept them anyway. Touched them before each shift, her fingertips tracing the worn toe caps as though reading Braille, though what the message said she could no longer quite articulate. Superstition, maybe. Or penance. Or simply the last remaining object that proved she hadn't imagined the first 34 years of her life. Chen was still standing there, watching her work. "Your suturing technique," he said, his voice carrying the tentative quality of someone asking something they weren't sure they had permission to ask. "The last trauma code we ran, the laceration repair on that construction worker, I watched you close it in 47 seconds. Most nurses I've seen take 2-3 minutes. The stitches looked, I don't know. Military, maybe." Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 heartbeat. Just long enough for the silence to become a living thing between them. Then she continued with the next task, her movements resuming their metronomic pace. "Good lighting helps," she said flatly. "And practice. Lots of practice." She didn't elaborate. She never did. But that night, in the break room at 2:08 a.m., while the hospital settled into the particular quiet that only came during the deepest hours, Margaret allowed herself to remember the field hospital outside Sanjin Valley, the way blood pooled in the gaps between tent stakes, the sound a ventilator made when it ran on battery power in the middle of desert darkness. She had performed those sutures, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, not in the luxury of proper lighting and sterile conditions but in the chaos of incoming casualties stacked 3 deep on every surface, with shell-shocked medics handing her instruments and mortar fire painting the sky orange. The Kandahar field splice wasn't called that in the textbooks. It was called an expedient closure technique, designed for maximum speed when speed meant the difference between survival and exsanguination. Speed meant lives. She had learned it in blood and adrenaline and the understanding that there were no second chances, no do-overs, no patients you could afford to lose because the next helicopter was already inbound and the tent was already full. Chen had recognized it. He shouldn't have, but he had. That meant he'd either trained in combat medicine or he'd served, and either way it meant the visibility she'd so carefully constructed was beginning to develop cracks. Margaret allowed herself 3 seconds of controlled breathing, then returned to her suturing manual and the endless clinical notes that filled her nights. The hospital record-keeping was almost obsessive in her approach, not just documenting what had happened but noting timing, consistency, any discrepancies between what was billed and what was actually rendered. It was a habit from the Navy, where accountability meant lives and paperwork saved people just as surely as hands ever could. 2 floors above her, in an office that smelled of imported cologne and carpet that hadn't been vacuumed since Tuesday, Dr. Marcus Hargrove sat behind a mahogany desk reviewing the quarterly billing reports with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for a man watching a casino losing streak in real time. His tie was Hermes. His cufflinks were platinum. The wedding ring on his left hand was a gift from money that hadn't belonged to his wife's family, though she believed it had. The sutures in the margins of these reports told a different story entirely. Margaret Walsh's meticulous notes, flagging times that didn't align with his logged surgical consultations, noting procedures that appeared on the invoice but not in the actual patient charts, creating a pattern of inconsistencies that would have been invisible to any casual reviewer but which sang like a siren song to someone who understood how to read the spaces between words. He had been performing phantom surgical consultations for 4 years. $37,000 a month. Consultations that occurred while he was simultaneously documented as being in the operating theatre performing other procedures. It had been elegant, airtight, protected by the sheer bureaucratic inertia of a hospital administration too overwhelmed to scrutinize one of the department heads. And then Margaret Walsh had come to the night shift, and she had started noting things, and she had kept noting them with the relentless precision of someone who understood that documentation was prophecy. It created the official record of what had actually occurred versus what anyone claimed had occurred. Hargrove made a phone call. His fingers moved with the kind of precision that suggested he'd made similar calls before, from this office, with similar consequences for whoever answered. "We have a problem," he said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to being accommodated. "The new night nurse. Walsh. She's been at Mercy General for 3 months, and she's developing a concerning habit of flagging inconsistencies in medical documentation. I need to know everything, her background, her references, who she knows, whether she's ambitious enough to use what she's found as leverage." There was a pause. He listened. His jaw tightened, then relaxed into something resembling a smile. "Understood. Yes. By tomorrow morning." He hung up and returned to the billing reports, but his eyes kept drifting toward the staffing schedule posted on his wall, the names of the night shift nurses listed in administrative green, Margaret's name in the 3rd position, unremarkable, invisible, exactly as she had intended. Down in Trauma Bay 3, Margaret was unaware that she had been marked. She was suturing a laceration on a patient who'd sustained a deep cut to his forearm from a workplace accident, and her hands had found their rhythm, the one that came from 10,000 hours of the same motion, from doing it in field hospitals and civilian ERs, doing it when lives depended on precision and doing it when insurance would have paid for the faster, shoddier version that would have left a scar. The stitches went in at perfect intervals. The knots were secure. The closure would heal without significant marks if the patient took care of it properly, which statistically he wouldn't, but that wasn't Margaret's problem anymore. She'd learned to stop carrying the weight of patient outcomes once they left the operating theatre. It was either that or become the kind of person who never slept. Chen was gone now, off to whatever rotation came next in the endless cycle of hospital medicine. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical humming. The ventilator in the corner wheezed its metronome rhythm. Margaret tied the final suture and clipped the thread with the decisive snap of trauma shears that had once carried her call sign engraved into the handle but which she'd scrubbed clean years ago, leaving only the ghost of letters visible if you knew to look. She didn't know that Dr. Hargrove had just begun making phone calls that would reshape the trajectory of everyone at Mercy General. She didn't know that her own instinct for documentation had marked her as either a whistleblower or a threat, and Hargrove was someone who preferred to neutralize threats before they became official complaints. She didn't know that the combat veteran she'd spent 3 years burying was about to be excavated by a doctor so confident in his power that he'd never considered the possibility that the quiet woman with the scarred knuckles might know exactly who he was and what he'd been doing all along. For now, she finished dressing the wound, made notes in the chart with her usual meticulous precision, and moved through the hospital corridors toward her locker at the end of the shift, where a pair of worn boots waited in the darkness, their leather cracked and patient, like a story no one was asking her to tell. The lunch tray caught the edge of Hargrove's shoulder at precisely 12:41 p.m. on a Tuesday in the crowded cafeteria of Mercy General, Norfolk. He didn't step aside. He stepped into her path. Margaret felt the collision before she saw it, a deliberate angle, a shifted weight, the kind of movement that wasn't accidental but was deniable enough that witnesses would second-guess what they'd seen. The tray tilted. Soup splashed across the tile floor in a spreading arc the color of rust. A roll scattered like a live thing, skittering under a nearby table. Her apple followed, the sound of it bouncing small and sharp against linoleum. The room went dead silent. 23 pairs of eyes turned. Hargrove stepped back, brushed an imaginary speck from his white coat, and smiled the way a hunter smiles before pulling the trigger. Margaret knelt to gather the pieces. Her scrubs were soaked at the hip, tomato soup darkening the green fabric like spilled blood. 10-1 she quits within a week, Hargrove announced to the cluster of residents orbiting his table. His voice carried, loud enough that the cafeteria line stopped moving. Any takers? She's got that look about her. 3 months in and she's already folding. Laughter spilled from his inner circle like something poisoned, spreading through the room in ripples. A nurse Margaret had never spoken to turned away, embarrassed on her behalf. Hargrove pulled a patient chart from under his arm, the folder thick with notes and test results. He dropped it at Margaret's feet with the deliberate precision of someone making a point. The pages scattered across the wet tile. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. The word came out like a slur. "That's more your speed." Filing. Cleaning. Fetch work. Margaret knelt deeper. Her hands moved, gathering pages one by one. Soup-soaked, her fingers trembled as she pressed them dry against her leg. One tear escaped, just one, the kind of tear that comes not from breaking but from the effort of not breaking, that thin line between composure and catastrophe. She didn't wipe it away. She let it track down her face as she worked, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, her breathing controlled through her nose like a person underwater learning not to drown. Then she stood. Her eyes met his. Not with anger. With something quieter. Something that sounded like concrete poured cold. A man who needs to humiliate someone to feel powerful has already lost everything that matters, she said. Her voice was steady as stone, the kind of steady that comes from having survived things worse than words, from having held dying men together with her hands, from having learned long ago that the people who hurt others were the ones actually breaking. You know that, don't you? On some level, you already know. The cafeteria had stopped breathing. Margaret gathered the last of the chart pages, straightened, and walked away. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved between tables, but her head stayed high. Her shoulders didn't curve inward. She didn't rush. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the feeling of chains held in place by sheer will, by the knowledge that if she let herself move the way her body wanted to move, if she let herself speak in the voice that lived underneath the nurse voice, things would break that couldn't be unbroken. She deposited the wet chart at the nurse's station, continued to the locker room, and sat on the bench in front of her locker without opening it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, "Working late again?" "I left lasagna." Margaret stared at the message for a long time without answering. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their monotonous frequency, the same sound she'd learned to tune out years ago in field hospitals where the hum meant air conditioning and air conditioning meant a building that was still standing. 2 days later, on day 6 of Hargrove's campaign, the nurses' station erupted into laughter. Hargrove had cornered her during shift change, his voice loud enough that four nurses stopped their charting to listen. Maggie the Meek, he called her, the nickname carrying like a thrown knife. I've seen janitors with more spine. How'd someone like you even get through nursing school? Did they have a remedial track? His residents tittered on cue, trained seals responding to their master's voice. Margaret didn't look up from her notes. She took one measured breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the breathing pattern she'd learned on a transport helicopter over the Arabian Sea when she'd had to watch a young seaman die because the medic wasn't competent enough to establish for access on a rolling platform. I learned that competence doesn't require an audience, she said quietly. Then she turned a page in her chart and wrote something down, her handwriting precise as a surgeon's stitch. Hargrove's face darkened. He opened his mouth to say something else, but one of the senior nurses, a woman named Patricia who'd been at Mercy General for 17 years, was suddenly standing between them, asking Margaret to help with a supply inventory. The moment passed. Hargrove stalked away, his resident circle trailing like remoras behind a shark. But something had shifted in his expression. The casual cruelty had calcified into something harder, more deliberate. He made his first call that evening, his office door closed, his voice low but steady. The board chairman picked up on the second ring. They had history, referrals, reciprocal favors, the kind of financial relationship that existed in the space between what was legal and what was profitable. I need you to trust me on this, Hargrove said. Walsh needs to go. I can't have someone at her level of competence around, she's a liability. She sees things. She files things. You understand? She's a loose end. The chairman understood. The chairman always understood. On day 8, in the supply room where they kept the dressings and the trauma tape and the 4 kits that cost more money than most people made in a week, Hargrove blocked the doorway. Margaret approached with her request list in hand. She saw him standing there, a deliberate barrier, a test of whether she would ask him to move or simply squeeze past. She squeezed past. His arm came up, his voice dropped to something that wasn't quite audible to the corridor behind them. You know, I'm trying to figure out what your story is. What's a woman like you doing in a place like this? You've got hands that have done things, Walsh. Real things. Hard things. But you push them into scrubs and play nurse like you're ashamed. He leaned against the doorframe with the casual dominance of a man who'd never imagined a consequence. I wonder what HR would think if I told them about those hands. Where they've been. What they've done. Margaret stopped. Turned. Met his eyes, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not fear. Recognition. The look of someone who'd heard a threat in a language they actually understood. Your desperation is showing, Doctor, she said. Then she walked past him, back into the corridor, back to her station, back to her charts and her vitals and her careful, meticulous notes that never missed a discrepancy, that never failed to flag inconsistency, that were, unbeknownst to her, currently being reviewed by 3 separate investigations launched from 3 separate phone calls made over the course of 48 hours. Alone in his office, Hargrove made the second call. A woman answered at the nursing school registrar's office in Richmond. He introduced himself as her name appeared in the database verification system. I'm verifying credentials for Margaret Walsh, graduated 2018. I need complete transcripts and any previous service notation. The registrar pulled the file. There was a pause, the sound of someone reading something unexpected. Her records show prior military service, the registrar said slowly. But that section is redacted. I can't access the details without a formal request through the Department of Defense. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. Something was there. Something hidden. Something that required military channels to uncover. He made the third call before his first coffee of the morning went cold. The state licensing investigator picked up on the 4th ring. Hargrove kept his voice level, professional, concerned. I'm seeing concerning irregularities with one of our staff members. Margaret Walsh, RN. She may be practicing beyond her civilian scope. There are some technical procedures I've observed that suggest military-level training she's not disclosing. Possibly unauthorized. I thought you should know. The investigator wrote it down. Opened a file. Assigned it a case number. By that evening, Sergeant Major Coleman had already touched down at Mercy General's trauma entrance, his medevac halo rotor wash shaking the windows of the ICU. He came in hot, 3 pieces of shrapnel still embedded in his left side, his chest trauma significant enough that the medics had radioed ahead with the precision of men who'd learned what words meant in trauma language. Vitals crashing. Tension building in the left hemithorax. Blood loss quantifiable and accelerating. Margaret was assigned his triage assessment. She cut away his uniform with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, revealing the landscape of wounds beneath, jagged tears in skin that told stories of explosions and metal fragments and the microsecond decision between life and death that no one without training could understand. A young combat medic was assisting her, a specialist second class named Rivera with the kind of focused intensity that told her he'd seen real work. As Margaret's hands moved across Coleman's chest, performing the initial assessment, Rivera watched her fingers work. She was applying a field dressing to the larger wound, and her splice, the way she angled the gauge, the tension she held, the pressure vector she was creating, was something specific. Something precise. Rivera's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He said quietly, freezing mid-hand. That's a Kandahar field splice. Where'd you learn that? The room seemed to contract around the question. Margaret's hands paused for half a heartbeat, just long enough that Rivera saw it, just long enough that something in the air changed temperature. Just muscle memory, Margaret said, her voice smooth as ever. She continued working. Move the fustand closer. We're going hot. Rivera didn't push. He'd learned when he was 22 years old, in a place whose name wasn't supposed to be spoken aloud, that some knowledge didn't have a civilian explanation. That some people carried things in their hands that training alone couldn't teach. Coleman was conscious enough in those moments before sedation to register her face. His eyes were unfocused, the morphine already in his system making everything soft-edged and dreamlike, but something in her face, something in the set of her jaw or the color of her eyes or some chemical signal his brain had been trained to recognize, triggered something. Recognition trying to surface through chemical fog. His lips moved. Words that didn't quite form, something that might have been a name or might have been a prayer or might have been something from a memory so old it belonged to a different life. Margaret worked faster. Behind the glass partition of the trauma bay, Hargrove watched. He saw the medic's reaction. He saw the technical precision. He saw her hands move through space like they were following muscle memory that went deeper than any civilian training program could install. He stepped into an empty corridor and made his first strategic call, the kind of call that moved beyond simple bullying into something more calculated, more dangerous. The state licensing investigator had his number marked in red on a desk file by noon. By evening, Sergeant Major Coleman was wheeled to the ICU, his condition stable but critical, a line of monitors and drips surrounding him like a technological ecosystem designed to replace the things his body could no longer do alone. Margaret stripped off the bloody gloves that had saved his life without knowing they were saving his life, without understanding that the man on the gurney had lived through a night in Baghdad 3 years prior where a woman with the same hands had held 11 men together in the dark while the world burned around them. She disposed of the gloves in the biohazard bin. Washed her hands under water that ran clear and cold. And didn't know that across Norfolk, in an office downtown, in a nursing school registrar's file, and in an investigator's case folder, her name had just started moving through 3 separate systems like water finding cracks in a foundation. What she didn't know was about to become very important indeed. The medevac rotor wash shook the emergency bay windows as the Black Hawk descended toward Mercy General's helipad. Margaret heard it first, that distinctive thud-thud-thud of a military helicopter, the sound that made her jaw clench even when she wasn't expecting it. The trauma alert had come through at 03 for 7 hours, Sergeant Major Coleman, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, multiple shrapnel wounds, severe chest trauma, inbound from Baghdad via Ramstein Air Base. 43 minutes in the air. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know his unit. She didn't know that by the time his boots touched American soil again, his case would become the hinge on which everything turned. The stretcher wheels squeaked against the tile as they rolled Coleman into Trauma Bay 2. Margaret was already there, scrubs fresh, 2 14-gauge angiocath needles already drawn, her hands positioned with the kind of readiness that only muscle memory could produce. The young combat medic she recognized from earlier that week was still present, the same one who'd watched her suture technique with something between admiration and confusion. He stood back as the transfer team worked, watching Margaret with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't name. Sergeant Major Coleman was conscious but barely. A man in his mid-40s, weathered the way only 3 tours of duty could weather someone, with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things most people can't imagine. His breath came shallow and fast. Oxygen sat 94%. Blood pressure 118/67, but trending down. Dr. Finch, the day-shift trauma surgeon, was examining him with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen 1,000 cases and treated each one like it was the only one that mattered. The CT scanner was already being prepped. Radiology would have images in 8 minutes. Margaret began her assessment with the precision of someone conducting a symphony she'd already played 1,000 times in a different life. She checked lung sounds, left side clear, right side diminished. She palpated his ribs, feeling for crepitus, for the telltale grinding of broken bone on bone. The antiseptic smell of the trauma bay mixed with something underneath it, something metallic and wrong. Blood. Not his blood yet. Just the ghost of 100 other patients who'd been here before him. Multiple shrapnel penetration, Dr. Finch said, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of military medicine practiced in civilian hospitals. Left anterior chest, left flank. 3 distinct wound tracks visible. We need imaging before we crack him open. Pressure dressing on the flank is holding, Margaret said, assessing the external bleeding. But his breath sounds are off on the right. Diminished. Not absent. Pneumothorax, the medic said quietly. Margaret glanced at him. Field diagnosis. We treated it with needle decompression in the chopper, second intercostal space. SATS came right up. Margaret's eyes met his for just a moment. She saw recognition there, not of her face, but of something in the way she was moving, in the efficiency of her touch. He knew what she was. He just didn't know how to ask. By Tuesday morning, Sergeant Major Coleman had been admitted to the ICU with a working diagnosis of traumatic pneumothorax, pending surgical consultation for the shrapnel wounds. The surgery was scheduled for 0800 with Drive Hargrove's team. Routine. Clean. By the book. But the moment the tension pneumothorax began to develop, the moment that careful balance between his lungs and his chest cavity began to collapse, everything stopped being routine. Margaret was monitoring his vitals at 0638 when she first noticed the decline. His oxygen saturation dropped from 94 to 91 in the span of 4 minutes. His breathing became more labored, each inhale a visible effort. She checked his neck for jugular distension. There. Subtle but present. Her hands moved to his chest, palpating, assessing, reading his body like a document written in a language she'd spent 20 years learning. Tension pneumothorax. The treated one wasn't holding. The needle decompression from the field was temporary, a bridge, not a destination. His lung was collapsing again, and this time faster. This time his heart was beginning to shift. She hit the call button. Trauma 2. Page Dr. Hargrove surgical team. Tension pneumothorax developing. Patient deteriorating rapidly. The charge nurse, a woman named Chen who'd been at Mercy General for 18 months and possessed the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that sometimes felt like indifference, acknowledged the page. Sending the message now. 8 minutes passed. Margaret continued monitoring, watching the cascade of collapse. Oxygen sat dropping to 88. His heart rate climbing to 142, tachycardic and irregular. The rhythm on the monitor showed the kind of stress pattern that meant his body was beginning to fail the math. How much can you lose? How fast? How long before the numbers stop meaning anything? Where's Hargrove's team? She asked. Chen checked the computer. Dr. Hargrove says there's a mass casualty drill in OR 3. All available surgeons are responding. He's rerouting you to. A drill? Margaret kept her voice level, but something in her eyes hardened. Check that again. Chen typed, frowning. It's on the surgical schedule. Started at 0630. All staff participating. Dr. Hargrove initiated it personally. The room felt very small suddenly. The monitors seemed louder. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the mathematics of conspiracy, to the careful orchestration of unavailability. Margaret had seen this before, not in a hospital, but in a forward operating base in Helmand province, where a patient coded in a hallway because the surgeons were 3 clicks out and pinned down by enemy fire. She had not been a nurse then. She had been something else. She paged the ICU attending. Dr. Reeves answered in 30 seconds. Sergeant Major Coleman, Margaret said. Deteriorating rapidly. Tension pneumothorax, SATS at 85, HR 148. Request immediate surgical consult. Who did you page? Reeves' voice was sharp. Hargrove's team. They're in a drill. A drill? Reeves swore quietly, a single word that carried 18 years of frustration with administrative theatre. I'm coming up. Hang tight. But Coleman didn't have time to hang tight. The human body runs on physics, and physics has no patience for procedural delays. His oxygen saturation hit 78%. His blood pressure dropped to 94/52. The monitor showed compensatory tachycardia pushing 156 beats per minute. He was coding. Not yet officially, the heart was still beating, but the equation was tilting. The numbers were beginning their final descent. I need a surgeon, Chen said, panic entering her voice. Someone get me a surgeon now. The crash cart was 3 feet away. Margaret was already moving toward it. Crash cart, intubation kit, 14-gauge angiocath needles, everything a field surgeon would need to buy a patient time in a burning hallway in Kandahar. She pulled what she needed with the kind of automaticity that transcends thought. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Just like the medic had done. Just like she had done, in a life that officially no longer existed. The young combat medic appeared in the doorway, the one from the trauma bay, the one who'd been watching her with that terrible recognition. His eyes widened as he understood what she was about to do. He said quietly. If you know how to do a needle decompression, now is the time to do it. Margaret prepped the needle. The room held its breath. The monitors held their terrible mathematics. She found the space between Coleman's ribs, found it the way a musician finds the exact note, and inserted the needle. The hiss of air escaping was like the sound of pressure releasing, like the sound of a body finally being allowed to breathe. The oxygen saturation began climbing. 81, 85. 89, 91. Who taught you that? The charge nurse's voice was almost a whisper. Margaret didn't answer. She was already setting up the monitoring system, beginning what would become an 8-hour vigil, pulling a chair next to the bed because she had no intention of leaving Sergeant Major Coleman alone in this hallway, in this hospital, in this carefully orchestrated theater of unavailability. She knew what was being done. She knew why. She also knew that Hargrove had just made a mistake he couldn't take back. Dr. Reeves appeared at the door, took in the scene, Margaret sitting beside Coleman, his vitals stabilized, the needle decompression complete, and his face went very still. How long have you been monitoring him? Since the needle decompression. His SATS are stable at 91 now. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding flowing across his face like realization. He left without another word and headed directly for Hargrove's office. Dr. Hargrove arrived in Trauma 2 exactly 43 seconds later, his face carrying the expression of a man who had just realized his orchestration had produced unexpected noise. He stood in the doorway, looking at Margaret sitting beside the sergeant major, looking at the needle decompression kit, looking at the vitals monitor showing stabilized numbers. Practicing medicine without a license, Nurse Walsh. His voice had the texture of a smile, but his eyes carried something else. Calculation. The moment when a predator realizes the prey has teeth. Margaret turned to face him, and the composure in her expression was absolute. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, came from somewhere very deep and very calm. I'm staying with him until he's stable. Suit yourself, Hargrove said. It'll make the paperwork easier. He left. But something had shifted. The balance of power in that room had changed, had tilted toward the quiet nurse sitting in the chair, the one with the scarred hands and the perfect field technique and the kind of calm that comes from having already faced worse things than an angry doctor in a Norfolk hospital. Margaret settled into the chair. She had done this before. She would do it again. For 8 hours if necessary. For as long as Sergeant Major Coleman needed. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Outside, the Norfolk rain began to fall, and somewhere in the hospital, in offices and conference rooms and email chains, the machinery of consequence was beginning to turn. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Outside the trauma bay, the Norfolk rain began to fall, and somewhere in the hospital, in offices and conference rooms and email chains, the machinery of consequence was beginning to turn. But Margaret Walsh didn't know about any of that yet. She only knew that Sergeant Major Coleman's oxygen saturation was dropping again, that the ventilator was working too hard, that his chest wasn't rising the way it should. Hour 1, 2:13 a.m. Margaret stood at his bedside with a 14-gauge needle, her movements economical, precise. The technique was called needle decompression, a thin hollow tube inserted at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, to release air trapped in the pleural cavity and crushing his lung. She'd done this 3 times in Baghdad, twice in the surgical tent at Camp Victory, once in a Humvee driving under fire. Her hands moved on their own, steady as a laser sight. The needle went in. The hiss of escaping air filled the small space like a punctured tire, and within seconds, the oxygen monitor climbed, 78 to 82 to 87. Coleman's chest rose with the ventilator's breath. The crisis paused. She should have left then. She could have left. The ICU nurse was watching the monitors, the physician was rounding every 2 hours, the protocol was clear. But Margaret pulled a chair beside his bed and sat down. She pulled her phone and set a timer for 12 minutes. Not hospital protocol. Not recommended. Not within her scope as a night shift floor nurse. But it was the only thing she'd ever been good at, staying. Watching. Being the last voice someone heard before their lungs failed completely. Hour 3, 5:19 a.m. The rain hammered the windows like artillery, and Margaret hadn't moved. She'd charted his vitals by hand, every 12 minutes exactly. Oxygen, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, Glasgow coma scale. The monitors beeped their electronic song, and she charted it all in blue pen on a yellow legal pad that she kept tucked in her scrub pocket. A young combat medic, the one assisting during the initial decompression, brought her a paper cup of terrible hospital coffee at around 4 a.m. His name tag read Peterson, and something in the way he watched her work made him hesitate before leaving. I served with a Navy corpsman in Kandahar, he said quietly. Moved like you. Same hands. Same way of knowing what was about to happen before it happened. Margaret said nothing. She took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like burnt diesel and regret. Peterson left, and she went back to watching. Hour 4, 6:31 a.m. The first real scare came when Coleman's oxygen saturation dipped to 71. The monitor's alarm blared, a sound like a car horn in a confined space, and Margaret was on her feet before the echo finished. Not a collapse, not yet, but the beginning of one. She adjusted the oxygen flow from 10 liters to 12, tilted his bed slightly backward to ease the work of breathing, placed her palm against his chest and felt the breath moving through him like a whisper. She counted, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathing. Still breathing. The saturation climbed, 74, 78, 81, back to 84. She wrote it down. Hour 4. Second episode. Responded to increased oxygen and position change. The young medic, Peterson, was walking past the room when the alarm went off. He stopped in the doorway, watched Margaret work, then nodded once and kept walking. He'd seen people freeze when alarms went off. He'd seen people panic, call for help, page a doctor, abandon the patient to protocols. Margaret did none of those things. She handled it the way a person handles something they've done 100 times before. Which she had. Just not in this hospital. Not in this uniform. Hour 6, 8:19 a.m. Coleman woke partially, his eyes unfocused but moving. The ventilator still breathed for him, the tube down his throat making speech impossible, but his eyes found hers across the small distance of the room. His hand, wrapped in gauze and 4 lines, moved slightly. Margaret stepped closer. His lips moved around the ventilator tube, forming words without sound. Baghdad. The fire. You were there. Margaret's face drained of all color. She placed her hand on his arm. Yes, she whispered, the single word like a key turning in an old lock. I was there. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She simply walked to the foot of his bed, picked up her chart, and wrote, Hour 6. Patient conscious, responsive. Aware of prior history. Vital stable. The pen didn't shake. Her handwriting was immaculate, each letter a small discipline, each number a refusal to give in to the weight of memory. Hour 8, 11:02 a.m. Sunrise was breaking across the parking lot in shades of amber and gold, and Margaret Walsh had not sat down in 6 hours. She had not eaten. She had not stepped away from the bedside. She had adjusted oxygen 3 times. She had caught another respiratory dip at hour 7, this one more serious, saturation dropping to 68 before she caught it, and had manually bagged him with an ambu bag for 90 seconds while calling for the respiratory therapist, maintaining positive pressure with the kind of muscle memory that lives in hands, not in the conscious mind. Coleman had stabilized again. The machines beeped. The rain continued. Then the elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. Hospital Administrator James Blackwell stepped out, flanked by 2 security officers. He was a tall man with the expensive haircut of someone who'd never questioned his own authority, and he carried a manila folder like a knife. Behind him walked Dr. Hargrove, and even from 50 feet away, Margaret could see the satisfied smile on the older doctor's face. The smile of a man who'd finally gotten his way. The administrator walked to the room without hesitation. The security officers remained outside. Blackwell entered, his shoes clicking against the linoleum like a countdown. Margaret Walsh. His voice was official, stripped of all humanity. You're suspended from duty effective immediately, pending investigation into credential fraud, practicing beyond scope of practice, and irregularities flagged by this hospital's Quality Assurance Department and the Virginia Board of Nursing. Margaret's hands didn't stop moving. She was adjusting Coleman's oxygen again, reading the monitor, writing the time in her log. This patient will die without monitoring, she said quietly. Not a question. A statement of fact. That's no longer your concern, Blackwell said. You're to vacate the premises immediately. Escort will accompany you to your locker. The security officers entered. One of them, a woman with the thick shoulders of someone who'd done this job for 2 decades, placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. Margaret didn't resist. She set down her pen, set down her legal pad, and stepped away from the bedside. Coleman's eyes followed her, panicked suddenly, and he tried to speak around the ventilator tube but only produced a ragged, desperate sound. Margaret paused at the door. She didn't turn around. She couldn't turn around, because if she looked at him again, the dam would break, and she had never broken in front of anyone. "You're going to be okay, Sergeant Major," she said to the doorframe, to the rain outside, to no one and everyone. "The respiratory team will monitor you. You're stable now." The escort, the woman with the thick shoulders, walked her to the employee locker room on the 3rd floor. Margaret's locker was number 247, and it opened with a key she'd worn on a chain since the day she was hired. Inside was almost nothing: a spare scrub top, a bottle of ibuprofen, a phone charger, and at the very bottom, tucked in a plastic bag tied with a rubber band, her combat boots. They were worn leather, broken in by years of desert heat and desert cold. The soles were reinforced, the laces were replaced multiple times, and there was a faint bloodstain on the right heel that had never completely washed out. They were the only physical object Margaret had kept from her old life. The only evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had ever existed. The security officer, whose name tag read Martinez, picked up the boots carefully, as though handling evidence at a crime scene. "I have to note everything you remove from your locker," Martinez said, not unkindly. "Hospital policy." She placed the boots in a clear plastic evidence bag, sealed it, and wrote Margaret's name, the date, and the time in permanent marker, Margaret Walsh. The 22nd of July, 2024, 11:51 a.m. Margaret watched the woman seal her past away. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply nodded once, and walked out of the hospital into the grey Norfolk morning. The parking lot was wet from the rain. Puddles reflected the sky like broken mirrors. Margaret sat in her car for 20 minutes, still wearing her scrubs, still smelling like hospital antiseptic and sweat, and then she drove home. Her apartment was quiet. Her 14-year-old daughter, Zara, wasn't supposed to be home until 3 p.m., school didn't let out until then. But at 2:17 p.m., a door opened and Zara stood in the kitchen, backpack on her shoulder, confusion washing across her face like a tide. "Mama." Zara's voice was small, uncertain. "Why are you home early?" Margaret sat at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, and the tears came. Not the small, controlled tears of someone managing their emotions. The full, silent, body-shaking tears of someone who'd held everything together for 8 hours straight and had just reached the end of what a human being can hold. Zara's confusion deepened to fear. "Mama, what's wrong? Did someone die?" Margaret looked at her daughter, 14 years old, never having seen her mother cry, never having seen her break, never having seen anything but competence and control and the careful distance of a woman who'd learned to survive by never letting anyone close enough to hurt her. "I tried to save him," Margaret whispered. "I tried so hard, and they still took me away." Zara ran to her mother and held her, and Margaret held her back, and neither of them understood yet what had just begun. The emergency board hearing convened 3 days later in the main conference room at Mercy General, and every seat was full. 43 staff members crowded the space: nurses, residents, attending physicians, administrators, all of them with phones on their laps, cameras ready. The fluorescent lights cast everything in institutional white. Margaret sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands folded, wearing fresh scrubs because she owned almost nothing else. Across from her, Dr. Hargrove arranged his files with the precision of a man who believed documentation was armor. The hospital administrator, Patricia Chen, opened the proceeding with careful neutrality. "This hearing is to address the complaint filed against Margaret Walsh regarding protocol violations and credentialing irregularities. Dr. Hargrove, you may proceed with your evidence." Hargrove stood. He was a man built like old money, tailored suit, watch that cost more than a used car, the kind of posture that came from never being told no. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who had orchestrated for successful character assassinations in his career. He opened his mouth to speak. The doors to the conference room burst open. 2 orderlies wheeled in a stretcher. On it lay Sergeant Major Coleman in marine dress blues, his uniform pressed despite the endotracheal tube still threaded through his throat, the ventilator trailing behind like an unwilling companion. His lung capacity had improved enough that the doctors had scheduled extubation for tomorrow. Today, he had demanded one thing: to be here. The room went so quiet the ventilator's rhythmic hiss became the only sound. Coleman's eyes swept across the assembled staff until they locked on Margaret. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just held his gaze across 30 feet of stunned silence. His right hand lifted from the bed rail with visible effort, each muscle movement a negotiation with broken ribs and stitches that pulled like wire. His arm rose to his chest. And in the universal language of the military, he executed a salute. Weak. Trembling. Perfect. His lips moved around the endotracheal tube, forcing the word out with the grinding determination of a man who had survived being buried under concrete. Reaper. The room fractured. Zara stood from the back row, her voice breaking like young ice in spring. That was her call sign. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. She was 17, wearing a hoodie, and she was claiming her mother with the certainty of someone who had finally stopped being ashamed. That was her call sign in Baghdad. Margaret's daughter had done her research. She'd spent 2 nights in the Norfolk Public Library, and 1 night on a military database that asked no questions, and she'd found her mother in redacted official records and veteran forums and a single Wikipedia article about a field hospital bombing in 2007. She'd seen the casualty count. She'd seen the rescue narrative buried in the comments section of a military blog, written by someone with a username like Veteran Soldier 2847. Senior Chief Walsh pulled 11 of us from that tent. Burning tent. Under fire. Kept us alive for 14 hours. A nurse named Rodriguez, whose hands had shaken during Margaret's suspension, pulled the file from the stack in front of her. The patient file. She read aloud, her voice growing louder with each sentence. Patient states responding nurse saved his life during field hospital bombing, Baghdad, 2007. Patient confirms nurse identification as Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, call sign Reaper. Medical record cross-reference, Bronze Star for Valor. Bronze Star for Valor. Silver Star for Distinguished Service. Rodriguez looked up, her eyes wet. Silver Star. Another Silver Star. And she was a floor nurse here. The doors opened a second time. A man in dress navy blues entered, captain's bars on his shoulders, the bearing of someone who had commanded men in countries that didn't appear on regular maps. Behind his eyes lived 20 years of command decisions. This was Commander James Mitchell, SEAL Team 3, retired, now working security contractor consulting. He'd gotten Coleman's call 3 days ago and hadn't hesitated. He'd flown from San Diego in 6 hours. Senior Chief Margaret Walsh served under my command in 2007, Mitchell said, and his voice carried the weight of official testimony. She pulled 11 men from a burning surgical tent during a coordinated enemy assault. Mortar rounds were impacting 50 meters from her position. She stayed with those men for 14 hours until extraction was possible. She was recommended for the Navy Cross by every officer present. The Navy Cross, Rodriguez whispered. The doors opened a third time. A 2-star admiral entered flanked by 2 Navy MPs whose dress uniforms looked like they could cut glass. Rear Admiral Sarah Michaels had authorized her own convoy to Norfolk the moment the Secretary of the Navy called her directly. She had 3 silver stars herself. She understood what she was looking at. She stepped to the center of the room, and her voice, when she spoke, was loud enough that every phone camera caught every word, and every word rang with the finality of a court-martial finding. Dr. Edward Hargrove, you are terminated effective immediately for systematic billing fraud totaling $2.3 million over 6 years, and for gross endangerment of a decorated combat veteran entrusted to your care. You will surrender your hospital credentials and cooperate with the federal investigation now underway by the Department of Justice. Remove him. The 2 MPs moved with practiced efficiency. One of them, a petty officer first class with a scar along his jawline, approached Hargrove's chair. Hargrove stood on his own, his face the color of old clay. He looked at Margaret once. She didn't look back. As he was escorted toward the door, the petty officer stopped him. Turned his credentials around. The ones that said Dr. Edward Hargrove, Chief of Surgery, Mercy General Hospital. With a single precise motion, the petty officer folded the laminate in half. Crease in the middle. 1 clean break. He placed both pieces on the table. The sound of his footsteps left the room. The ventilator's hiss continued. Admiral Michaels turned to Margaret. "Senior Chief, we have some paperwork for you to review. Welcome home." Then she turned to face the assembled staff. "The rest of you need to understand something. What you just witnessed wasn't a disciplinary hearing. It was a national security review of personnel clearance. We're finished here." She left with the same authority she'd entered with. Coleman was wheeled back to the ICU. Mitchell stayed with him, sitting in the visitor's chair, not speaking, just being present in the way that only people who had seen what he'd seen could manage. Rodriguez approached Margaret in the hallway. "I'm sorry. I should have." "You did the right thing," Margaret said. "You read the file. That's all anyone ever has to do." 6 months later, Margaret walked through the front entrance of Mercy General for her first shift in her new position, Clinical Education Director, Trauma Medicine. The salary was higher. The hours were consistent. She would spend her days training nurses in the field-level techniques that most hospitals in America had forgotten how to teach. She stopped in the lobby. In a glass shadow box mounted at eye level, preserved like a relic in a cathedral, were her combat boots. The ones confiscated as evidence. The ones that had walked through Baghdad street markets and hospital corridors and the parking lot of Mercy General on the day her world collapsed. They'd been cleaned but not polished. The scuffs remained. The wear remained. The story remained. The plaque beneath read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, USN, Ret, 3 silver stars, 2 bronze stars, call sign, Reaper, still saving lives. Hospital staff had begun to gather. Nurses she knew. Residents who'd watched her work. The young combat medic from the day Coleman arrived, now hired as a full-time emergency nurse, stood to attention. Coleman appeared behind them, walking with a cane, his marine dress blues hanging off his shoulders the way they do on men whose bodies are still remembering how to function. He saluted her again, and this time his hand was steady. Margaret's daughter stood beside her mother, wearing Margaret's dog tags under her own shirt where they hung against her collarbone like a secret made public. "You stayed 8 hours when nobody else would," Coleman said, his voice still rough from the endotracheal tube. "You stayed when it cost you everything." Margaret looked at the boots in the shadow box. She looked at the people in the lobby. She looked at her daughter, finally understanding. "I didn't stay because I'm brave," Margaret said quietly. "I stayed because leaving you alone was unthinkable. That's not heroism. That's just the job." She moved toward the training wing, her new boots clicking against the tile, different boots, but she'd threaded the laces from the old ones through these new ones, so they carried forward their weight, their history, their story. In the training room, she stood before a class of 20 nurses from hospitals across Virginia. Young nurses. Eager nurses. Nurses who had learned trauma care from textbooks and simulation and YouTube videos, but who had never felt a man's life hanging in their hands like a glass of water they couldn't spill. She held up a 14-gauge angiocath needle. "This is how you think about a tension pneumothorax," Margaret said. "Not as a diagnosis. As a death sentence you interrupt. As a man who will die in 4 minutes unless you perform a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. You're not being gentle. You're being efficient. Gentleness is a luxury you don't have. Speed is mercy." Late that night, well after her shift ended, Margaret checked on a critical patient in the ICU. A woman, 73 years old, recovering from aortic repair. Margaret adjusted her monitors. Checked her O2 Saturday. Verified her pain management. The resident on call had approved her discharge from ICU to a step-down bed in the morning. Margaret stayed anyway. An extra hour. 2 hours. Until the woman's REM sleep deepened and her breathing synchronized with the ventilator's cycle, and Margaret could be certain, truly certain, that the next 8 hours wouldn't bring crisis. A junior resident found her at the bedside at 2:02 a.m., standing in the shadows, the monitor's blue glow the only light in the room. "Why do you always stay?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She watched the woman sleep. Watched her lungs fill and empty, the small miracle of continued breathing that most people never had to think about. Because the hardest battles aren't fought in daylight, Margaret said finally. And true class is what you do when the lights go out. She turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the monitor's glow. And she stayed in that darkness, keeping watch the way she always had, the way she would teach her nurses to keep watch, the way that meant someone who was vulnerable would never be alone. Subscribe, like, and comment if you believe the quietest people in the room often carry the strongest stories. Share this video with someone you know who fights battles nobody sees.